What's email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with David Burkus, organizational psychologist and best-selling author of 4 books, including Best Team Ever. We pick up the discussion with a question for David about how leadership can best clarify priorities within organizations and team structures. Now, you also say in the book that when team members know what's expected of them and they trust others to do it, they perform at a higher level. The more clarity created, the better the team performs. I couldn't agree more, because when I'm teaching my classes, I always ask, how many of you are working on more than one project at a time? And of course, the entire room will raise their hands, because who only works on one at a time now? Yeah. But then I ask, okay, and how many of the current projects are considered to be top priority? And of course, everybody laughs. But because it's a joke, because they're all top priority, which means They're all the same priority. And you actually talk about that, and you say that we need to make priorities clear. And you actually talked about an Inc. magazine finding where they interviewed 600 different companies, the leadership of 600 different companies, and asked them what percentage of the people, your employees, you think understand your priorities. And 64% was what the expectation was. The actual was only 2%.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? I think, what was it? Was it Jim Collins that said, I think first, that if you have more than 3 priorities, you don't actually have any, right? And Greg McEwen, the chap who wrote Essentialism, he actually pointed this out to me, and I don't think it made it into the book, but the word priority for the first 400 years of its use in the English language was singular. It didn't have a plural form of priority. Right. And then we decided we had priorities, and that's when all hell broke loose. Right. Because then how many can you have? And I think that's really the key, with the executives surveyed, thinking 64%, they see it written down all the time. They're paying attention to the strategic documents, the 30,000 foot view. So they see those lists all the time. The day-to-day people don't. And when you just keep throwing things at them and you're not making it clear which one, is that key priority. And sometimes it's not necessarily a project, which project is more important, but it's kind of this clarifying question. Okay. I'm going to tell you a story here, and I'm going to ask everybody who's listening to forgive me if this turns out to not be true, right? Because I wanted to put it in the book because I heard it from a Southwest employee, but I could never find it written anywhere. And that is the late Herb Kelleher used to have this question he used to ask everybody, which was essentially does this make us a lower cost airline? Anytime there was a decision to be made, he would start from that. Does this make us a lower cost airline? He was so laser focused on what he would call, what did he call it? The democracy of the skies, making it more available to everyone to be able to fly for cheaper, right? I remember when I was younger, they had that whole "you're now free to move about the country" slogan. That was a real internalized thing to him and his team, right? That if they kept pushing the limits of what a low cost airline would be, they would make it more likely that people could connect and do all of the great things you can do through travel, right? And so I love that it's not necessarily a project. This project is the number one priority, or this function inside our organization gets the bulk of our resources because they're the most important, but a clarifying question. Remember that everything we do is united around this goal, right? Which is to become a low cost airline. Anytime somebody asked Herb for his thoughts on, hey, do we do this or do this? Do we do this or do this? It was which one brings us closer to the goal of being the lowest cost airline? I think it's not unlike the British rowing team also had the "will this make the boat go faster" question, right? I think we're lacking that, which is maddening, if I'm honest with you, Clint, because it's such a simple fix. I recognize that you and I, especially from the outside, working collaboratively with organizations, we're not going to change deeply held habits of dysfunction, 17 different priorities. We're not going to change that. But if we could just get people to laser focus in on when you're confused, ask yourself this one question to help juggle between these 3 or 4 priorities, we could make so much more progress on keeping people focused on what actually matters. If every organization, every project had that one defined question, knowing this is done, does this get us closer to done? And then we can really know what are the real priorities and what aren't.
So is that answering that question? Is that how you would suggest we establish clarity and keep it and maintain it as time progresses?
Yeah, well, I think it flows from that, right? It starts from that. Now, one thing we do talk about in the book is this idea of sort of commander's intent from the military, right? Let's define what done looks like. And so it starts there. I think clarity really happens well on a team. The clarity we're talking about in the book happens well on a team when you start there, but then you also know what does the roadmap look like? What are the different tasks? Who's responsible for what? And truthfully, a lot of times you don't really get peak levels of clarity unless you actually have an understanding for what that other person's task is, whether that's through job rotations or training people cross-functionally or what have you, right? Because so often a lot of our frustration comes from not understanding the timetables or the constraints that somebody who does a different type of work than us on the project but has to fit in. Like in the book, we talk about this fast food joint, Pal's Sudden Service, which is awesome, by the way, if you ever have the chance to get there. But the biggest thing is their error rate is like nearly flawless, right? So 1 in 3,000 orders. For example, like McDonald's is 1 in every single time I've ever ordered McDonald's for my kids. The order's wrong, right? And part of the reason they do that is that everybody's trained on almost every job in that location. And so at any time somebody can swap in, but also we can hold each other accountable to the standards of performance because we know what the performance is. Right. I like to think of it this way. When you have that level of understanding, that cross-functional, maybe I don't do your job as well as you, but I know what your job is. You can do what was it Gretzky that always used to say he likes to skate where the puck is going. Right. The reason he could skate where the puck was going is that he knew what the other person's position was and how they played it. So he knew where that person was going to hit the puck. Like you don't get it without that level of clarity, right? It's not just being able to watch the trajectory of a puck across the ice. It's knowing the other player and what they're going to do and then being able to predict how you best respond.
So I'll plant some seeds here for people to pick up the book and read it. You also talk in that section about team huddles and team charters, which I think is fascinating stuff. Yeah. Let's move on to, we talked about empathy already a little bit, so we don't have to spend a lot of time here, but you mentioned that empathy takes time to develop and it's a process. And so I guess first question is, why do you think empathy is so important? And, what are some strategies that we can help to get better? If it's a process and continues to develop, how do we get better at it?
Yeah, well, the vast majority of conflict, not task-focused conflict, personal conflict, the type of conflict that derails an organization comes from misunderstanding somebody's behavior, right? I made an assumption about how you were supposed to act and you acted differently. How dare you, right? How dare you respond differently than I thought you were going to respond, right? And that causes us to feel offended. That causes us to feel slighted, right? And so we don't know how to do it. Or it stems from, all of us communicate a little bit differently. I joked earlier about how like the easiest way to shut me up in a meeting is to say, all right, let's move this meeting over to email for further discussion. I write very brief emails, right? Other people like to write long, drawn-out novels. They'll write 2,000 word emails after the meeting anyway, even though we were all in the meeting, right? And if I just play to my own work preferences, I'm just going to scroll through that. Or maybe I'll copy and paste it into ChatGPT and ask it to give me the bullet points, but I'm not going to read it. But if I understand that the reason she does that is that writing is how she thinks, and she's giving us the gift of all of these hours of processing through everything that was heard at the meeting and then constructing her argument, like, I need to read that. I need to appreciate that. Right? That's their sort of contribution. So not only does empathy sort of make it much less likely that you're going to have that conflict that can potentially derail a project, it's going to teach you what to expect from someone else's behavior. And it's going to teach you how you can shape your communication in a way that speaks to their work preferences the best. I might have to write longer emails depending on the people that I'm working with, even though I don't want to. Right? Because it's in the best interest of the team. And I don't get at that unless I truly understand everybody on the team.
And I'm a big story guy, and you have lots of stories in your book, which I also enjoyed. And one of those you mentioned was, I think it's called Project Aristotle, which is done by Google. And they're trying to answer the question, what makes a team effective at Google? And they were surprised by the results, although, and the result was, they were trying to answer the question, how a team works together was so much more important than who specifically was on the team was what their finding was. But that wasn't a surprise to you.
No, well, because I'm an organizational psychologist, right? So no surprise, the human factor makes a difference, right? That's what we actually believe. Yeah. So Project Aristotle, we were talking earlier about collective intelligence. Project Aristotle was named that way because it had a similar goal of collective intelligence, or what Covey would call synergy. Aristotle was the person who's attributed as saying that great things happen, when the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That phrase, whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Apparently that originally came from Aristotle. So that's why they codenamed the research Project Aristotle. And when they started out, they thought they were going to find, you need these two different personality types, and you need an engineer, or like you were saying earlier, you need a doer and a dreamer, a strategic person and an innovative person, and blah, blah, blah. And you just have to have these little, and then basically they set out to look for all of that. And after they examined it all based on their performance metrics and what they collected during interviews and personality tests and all that sort of stuff, they found nothing. Basically no correlation, zero done. Oops, there's millions of dollars and 18 months of research down the drain, right? It wasn't until they started saying, okay, let's get qualitative for a second and let's start paying attention to the norms and the behaviors, what I would call the culture, right? But what they said, the norms, the behaviors, the way people interact, the way they treat each other, let's pay attention to that. And that's when they started to find a lot of stuff. I in the book, we talk about this story inside the psychological safety section because psych safety was the number one thing they found. But they also found reliability and dependability. In other words, they have conversations about what they're working on with each other in a way that looks a lot like a huddle, that looks a lot like clarity and a little bit of empathy, right? And they talked about meaning and impact, which is like pro-social purpose. But by far, that sense of psych safety was the number one predictor. Teams that made a point to behave in a way that drew out everyone's ideas without the risk of judgment were consistently the highest performing teams inside of Google. And no surprise why. When you have teams that are willing to explore all possible options, they find the best option more often than the ones who aren't. When you have teams that are willing to talk about a failure openly and honestly and what happened, they learn from failure and they perform better in the future, right? These are things that shouldn't surprise us. And yet they often do, right? That when you can shape those habits and norms and behavior, and when you can hire a diverse group of people who are brilliant and then create a culture, an environment where their brilliance gets to actually contribute to the conversation gets better. That shouldn't surprise anybody, and yet it does.
Always. And that's actually a great segue to my next question, which was you talked about, one of the things is I call don't shoot the messenger. Which is kind of what you were just discussing as well, as people being open and honest and being able to give their opinion on why things didn't go well. And the example you give was Alan Mulally, who at the time was CEO of Ford Motor Company, and how he had said all these things, give me the truth, tell me the truth, don't hide the data. But then there was an example of the Ford Edge launch that happened, and one of the guys actually proved that he was his word.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to put it, actually. It took a while before one of the people on the senior leadership team to actually test whether or not all of Alan's words about trust and speaking up and all that sort of stuff were actually true, right? If you've ever worked with a automotive company in the US, or really, I'm going to be candid, any company in Detroit, or north I'm showing my bias here. I grew up in the Northeast of the United States too, which is funny. Like snark and hard language. Snark is my love language, right? And yet now I'm like, okay, there's this sort of harsh, we're going to rag on each other culture that undercuts people. In particular, at Ford, the culture that Mulally inherited was very much an intra-competitive culture. People thought their competition for promotion was more important than the competition against the other automakers, right? Or against Japan, which is why they were all, losing to foreign automakers. And so Alan came in and recognized we need to change some things about this culture. And one of them was we're not going to manage a secret. That was his term. You can't manage a secret. We're losing $17 billion. We need to be more open and honest about what the heck is going on. And so he tried to create this environment where the senior leadership team would get together every Thursday morning, 7 a.m., Thunderbird Conference Room, Dearborn, Michigan, and talk about how things really were. What's going right? What's going wrong? What is wrong, but we're fixing it, right? He actually called these, green, yellow, and red. He had people, when they were giving slide presentations, actually color code everything. Green, yellow, and red. Green, everything's on pace. Yellow, hey, we're off pace, but we're going to fix it. Red, we're clueless. We have no idea what's going on. And you think about the culture that I just described to you, no surprise. The first time Alan got together with them, everything was green, all green. We're going to lose $17 billion, but no one's willing to say what's actually going wrong. Right. And the thing that gets glossed over in that story, by the way, is it wasn't just week one. This went on for 8 weeks. For 8 weeks, they got together and did an exercise in futility because no one was willing to talk about it. But during that 8 weeks, Alan was slowly shifting the culture, right? Being more vulnerable himself, talking about things a little bit more honestly himself, encouraging people to share, trying to amplify unheard voices, matching people's little bit of trust with respect so that that flywheel of psychological safety could take off, right? And eventually, in week 9, one executive, Mark Fields, decided to step out in trust and talk about the production delays with the Ford Edge. There was a little, production issue. They knew how to fix it, but it creates a bottleneck. So they knew they weren't going to be able to launch the cars on time. And it got to the point where he couldn't hide it anymore. Like, if you've ever worked with a team where somebody tells you something's wrong, and as you're unpacking what's wrong, you realize you knew this a couple weeks ago, you just didn't tell us until now. Like, that's what actually happened. And so now you have multiple reasons why the team could fly off the handle at Mark, right? You have the fact that he'd been hiding the issue for weeks. You have the fact that he's responsible for the issue and you're just mad that it's happening, right? You have the fact that his failure is going to make so much extra work for the marketing and communication teams, the legal teams, all of those sort of things, right? So you have all of these reasons you can be mad. Alan wasn't mad. Alan just started clapping. Hey, Mark, that's great visibility. All right, what can we do to help him? In other words, if you think about what we were talking about earlier, Alan matched Mark's trust with respect, right? I respect that it took a lot of courage for you to actually make that share. And it's the type of share we want because we have to be able to find these flaws in order to fix them. So thank you for that. And when he did that, and then the following week, I should say also the following week, when everybody came back to the conference room and found that Mark hadn't been fired, I can't underscore enough how much walking into the room and seeing that Mark was still there, still had a job, really changed and shifted that culture. Then people started having real conversations. Alan would go on to say that incident was the moment that saved Ford, right? Because everybody else got to see what the real response to vulnerable moments was going to be moving forward. And now they could do it themselves. And so the slides started becoming reds and yellows and greens and whatever was going on, right? The true accurate picture. And over time, that lets you turn around the company. Alan led the company for 8 years. They went from $17 billion loss to a $6.6 billion profit the year he resigned. And not because of any one big strategic thing he did, but because of lots of little fixes that had to go on over that 8 years that had to build up a huge level of trust and respect, not just on the senior leadership team, but then flowing down from all of the other teams in order to pull off. Yeah. I love it. It's probably my favorite story. If you can't tell, it's my favorite story in the book to talk about.
Yeah, I think you talk and you have the saying, trust begets trust. And I think that was good because I also think you mentioned that he opened at his introductory press conference. They said, what's the best car? What car do you drive? And he said, I drive a Lexus, the best car that's ever been made.
Yeah. I mean, talk about like, I'm going to tell it like it is. I'm going to show you what that looks like in an opening press conference. When you're like CEO of a new publicly traded company, all you're supposed to say is blah, 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 innovation, blah, 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 shareholder value. Like, here's the new plan. Please believe me and invest some money so that our share price can go up, right? That's what you're supposed to do. And he gets asked, what kind of car do you drive? And he says, a Lexus. It's the finest car on the market. No, I mean, it obviously doesn't leave it there, right? I like to pause there for shock effect, but he obviously then goes into talking about how he thinks we can compete with Lexus and he's excited to take on the challenge. But the lesson was sent. And by the way, this isn't in the book, but it's true. All of the other executives on the senior leadership, they weren't driving Fords either, right? Not their day to day. I mean, they were driving Fords in public, but if you went to their garage at their house, you might find the one Ford they took to and from work. But the rest of the time, they didn't drive Fords. They didn't either. Alan was just the one that said, hey, we're going to call it like it is. And that starts with me.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned snark as your love language. I worked with a guy in Illinois for a long time. And when I first came to work at the company, he was probably 30 years older than me. And he was always giving me a hard time. And one of the other coworkers said, this means he likes you. I said, well, he likes me a lot because he gives me, Yeah, again, I'm a big story guy. And you talk a couple more as we wrap up here. You mentioned KPMG. And it was in the chapter on pro-social purpose. And they had done some studies and their I guess, employee thoughts about themselves wasn't all that great. And then they were able to improve their morale greatly by telling stories. Can you elaborate a little bit on that one?
Yeah. I mean, so this is, I think it's also a great example of like when we talk about pro-social purpose, it's about connecting the broad scale organizational why to an individual who, right? So in effect, KPMG 2014, they started this initiative to try and increase morale, increase engagement, employee engagement in the firm and what have you. And they started out telling big stories about the firm as a whole, right? Big mission-driven stories, really from pivotal moments inside world history, right? So the idea was, it was called the We Shape History campaign. But the idea was every video, every poster, everything started with, what do you do at KPMG? The idea being, what do you do? We shape history, right? And then in between, they would tell the story about how, for example, in 1992, it was KPMG South Africa office that certified the election of Nelson Mandela, right? First free and fair election in South Africa. KPMG was there to certify it. Or they would tell a story about how after September 11th, 2001 in New York, there were $9 billion in recovery efforts. You want to make sure that doesn't go to fraud and waste and that sort of thing. And so what did they do? They tapped KPMG to audit all of that to make sure that that actually went to healing the nation, right? And so what do you do at KPMG? Oh, we champion democracy, 1992 election story. We help nations heal, 9/11 story, right? And that moved the needle a little bit. Like, it's cool. It's cool when your company engages in, I don't know, I want to call it corporate propaganda, but that seems unfair. But you know what I mean? Like, It's cool when they tell you, hey, you're part of an organization that's done some pretty significant things. That's cool, but not that cool because you're not doing that, right? You're still at some random client's office in the Midwest grading their papers, right? Auditing their books, right? And so what they did is after they had done that and people kind of got the format, they flipped it and they said, now you tell us, what do you do at KPMG? And they launched this thing they called the 10,000 Stories Challenge. And the idea, 30,000 people in the firm at the time, the idea was to collect 10,000 stories of individual answers, right? And they even created like an app where people could replicate the posters that they had been hanging and what have you, so you could make your own poster. And they got some pretty cool responses, right? One of my favorites is, there was one that came back. I joked earlier about the Midwest. This one really did come from the Midwest. It said, I help farmers grow. I audit banks in the farm credit system. And that doesn't sound really all that cool, but if you're familiar with agriculture, right, in ag credit, you have borrow, plant, harvest, repay. You have this cycle that keeps family farms in business. Without that lending, nothing grows. And that person, even though they're just an auditor, that person is keeping that system in place. So they saw their own role as that, right? It's one of my favorite examples. And there were others. There were a lot of others, actually. There were 42,000 others, right? They wanted 10,000 stories. They got 42,000 stories. And here's what I think is interesting. If you're thinking like me, you're thinking, okay, accountants, 42,000 stories, 30,000 person firm. Okay, that means a couple people did the assignment twice, right? And by the way, it's always accountants. I taught B school for 10 years. It's always accountants that do the assignment twice. So you're not wrong to think that. But the truth is not everybody did the assignment, which means some people did the assignment thrice, right, to make up for it, but not everybody did the assignment. And the reason I put the story in the book is that when they did their annual engagement survey after the 10,000 Stories Challenge, they snuck a question in there. How well does your manager or your team talk about purpose? And what you can do when you sneak that question in there is you can separate the two different groups, the groups that took the challenge seriously and participated in it, and the groups that didn't, the groups that talk purpose on a regular basis, and the groups that don't. Not company purpose, not broad purpose, but our specific purpose, our answer to this 10,000 Stories Challenge. And then when you look at all of the other engagement numbers, you see a stark contrast. You have a 30% difference in, I'm proud to work at KPMG, or I feel that the work that I do is important. My favorite metric, only 3 out of 10 people, or let me flip that actually. 7 out of 10 people said, I rarely think about looking for a new job if they were in the purpose condition. Only 3 out of 10 people said that in the non-purpose condition. In other words, in the people that don't talk about purpose on a regular basis, 70% of them are probably looking for a new job right now, right? And again, we're not talking about how well KPMG like inundated people and made them memorize the company's mission statement. Most of those people surveyed have no idea what it is. I don't know what it is, right? And I did all of this research on them and I don't remember what it is. But I don't forget the farm credit story, right? I don't forget the I Restore neighborhoods for the person that helps with community development programs in the south side of Chicago. That was one of the other posters. Like, I don't forget those stories. I forget the slogans all the time. And humans and teams are the same way. When you can spend your focus not on, hey, let's regurgitate the mission statement, but hey, let's have a conversation about who is served by the work that you do. People remember that. Teams remember that, and you leverage that sense of pro-social purpose in such a way that you can really move the needle on their performance, on their increase in collaboration, and truthfully just on their overall motivation and willingness to put a little bit more into their work because they know that they're serving someone when they do.
Yeah, you said you don't always remember the slogans, or the taglines. I think there's a saying that says, people don't always remember what you tell them, but they remember exactly how you made them feel.
Yeah. I think you know what's funny? I've heard that attributed to so many people. I think the most popular one's Maya Angelou, but hey, that quote makes us feel something, and that's why we remember it, right? So there you go.
Well, I shared with you before the call that we had 53 questions. I knew we wouldn't get them all, so I've already covered 19. Let me round robin the last 3 that I ask everybody, and then we'll wrap this up to be respectful of your time. So, are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
I think the hardest one, and we sort of hinted at it earlier, is really trying to make sure my responses to people meet their definition of a respectful response, right? You don't build psychological safety by getting people to trust you. You get people to trust you by showing you respect their contribution. And there's this difference between earned respect and owed respect. Earned respect people earn over time through doing great work and what have you. They're owed because they're humans and they intrinsically have value as a whole, right? And here's the key. It's hard to show owed respect when you don't understand how that person internalizes respect. And so the reason this one speaks to me a lot of times is like I said earlier, snark is my love language. And I find myself circling back on conversations often. My wife knows this. A couple other people in my life know this, that like, if they catch a whim, they're like, hey, you said so-and-so to Nicole and she got really offended by it. And I didn't even realize it. I have become, maybe I'm just getting wiser in my years or just older and more tired. Who knows? I have made it a point to circle back and go, hey, I'm sorry. Like, here's what I said. Here's what my intent was. I very clearly was not in line with my intent. And I'm sorry about that. But I also want to learn how would I respond better the next time? Right? Because I realize I'm not going to grow psychological safety with somebody unless I can show them respect in the language they're used to hearing it in. And so that's probably, of everything that I've written about from a professional business, high performing teams world, that's probably the one that I end up practicing in my personal life the most often. And I'm not great at it, but I'm trying.
I think the key there is we've all known people who apologize if I'm sorry that what I said offended you. Not that you're not really so you were actually sorry. You made this up. What can I do to not do this in the future? And so you were being, I think, really more intentful and purposeful, as opposed to just checking the box. Yeah, I apologize for making you mad.
Yeah, and it's funny because it feels, when you say it feels similar. Like in the moment, I think the reason people say, I'm sorry if I offended you, is that it wasn't their intent to offend, right? But we get defensive as soon as we find out we offended somebody else. But that doesn't mean you have to defend your entire actions, right? Like, it is possible to tell to another adult human, my intent was not to disrespect you, but I see that I did.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's possible to take ownership for both separately. But I think for a lot of us, it's hard to like break that. And so we end up defaulting into that. I'm sorry if anything I said hurt anyone. No, that's a different statement. My statement was, I did not intend to offend you, but I obviously did.
To me, when you said that, I heard intent behind your voice was you intended to do better, as opposed to just check the box in the PR firm that says, apologize. So
well, and that's if the PR firm will let you use the A word entirely, right? Because apologies, sometimes saying sorry implies liability, right? But exactly. yeah, I get it.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oh, okay. So, I mentioned, right at the top that I'd sort of always wanted to be a writer, always wanted to do this write for practitioners thing. And so early on in my career, shortly after my first book came out, or maybe just before, I got to meet one of my heroes, Daniel Pink, still one of the best social science writers, I think, out there. I think he splits the difference between the research and the practice at the same level that I want to. And I remember talking to him, and truthfully, I don't even remember what we were talking about, but we were in a casual conversation after the book had come out, and I was expressing my disappointment with some result. I don't even remember what it was. I was just like, hey, I'm not as big a deal as you, Dan Pink. So I'm mad, right? I don't remember what it was about. But I asked him at the end, I said, well, what would you do in this scenario? And he paused and he said, well, you got to remember at this point that I've been doing this for 20 years and you've been doing it for 2. So the first thing you should probably do is wait a bit longer, right? In other words, and what he's saying in that was just basically like, there are some things you can't rush. Some things just take time. You need to give yourself a longer runway before you get disappointed with your altitude, right? And again, I don't remember a lot of details of that conversation, but I remember that lesson that like there's some things that I get frustrated at. You'll never meet, by the way, and I don't like to think of myself as this, but you'll never meet a high achiever who isn't simultaneously appreciative of what they've achieved in their life and disappointed that they haven't achieved more. Like that's all of us, right? I'm sure you're the same way.
Yeah.
And the lesson in that moment was just like, slow down. Some things take time.
True. Now, as an author of multiple books, this is probably an unfair question, but what's the best book or article you've read recently, and what was the key takeaway?
Best book or article, and what was the key takeaway? So, probably one of my favorite authors as a whole, and another sort of intellectual hero of mine is a guy named Roger Martin. Roger was went to Harvard Business School, worked for Michael Port's Monitor Group, which was a strategy consulting firm that doesn't exist anymore, and then went and served as the dean of the Rotman School. And so I followed a ton of Roger stuff. And there's so many books that like any book by him add to my recommended reading list, right? But I was reading an article maybe 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about his time at the dean of the Rotman School. And he was talking about how he would often get faculty members who would come to him to complain, like about another faculty member. Like, hey, I'm sitting in your office and Clint's not doing this and Clint's not doing that and blah, 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 blah. And he had the same response. And this is so brilliant. He had the same response every single time. He would just pick up his phone and call his assistant, and he would say, hey, notify Clint that so-and-so are on our way to their office and we want to talk about this. And almost every single time the faculty member complaining would go, no, that's not necessary. I can handle it. We don't need to get Clint involved. And like, and I just love, what I love about that story, there's two lessons in there, right? Is number one is some people just engage in recreational complaining, right? Complaining for the sake that it's fun. And the best way to nip it in the bud is to subtly let them know that it's going to get back to whoever they're complaining about. So that's thing number one. But the other leadership lesson I love about it, right, is that often as a leader, we feel like we have the weight of the world or the weight of the whole project on our shoulders. And it's because we're choosing to be the bottleneck when a lot of times what we can actually just do is go, I think you two can handle it on your own. So I'm not going to solve this issue for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to Clint's office and we three are going to talk. And then as soon as I feel like I'm not needed, I'm going to bow out and send this subtle message that next time you two can handle this on your own. And I think that's how that's when leadership gets fun, to be honest. Not because you're handling recreational complaining. That's not fun at all. But what I mean is when you figure out how to delegate enough things that you can really focus in on the people and developing the people and growing the people instead of just responding to every 5-alarm fire all of the time, that's when leadership gets fun. And so I was reading all of that in an article that he published maybe about a month ago. And it still is in the top of my mind. And I'm still looking for ways of like, how can I make sure to delegate more of that subtly, right? Yeah.
Is that my new title, professional complainer? Is that how it works?
Recreational complainer. Recreational. Okay. Some people are probably professional complainers too, but yeah. I mean, it's like the number one side of a toxic company culture, right? Is when people who have no ability to change something that's wrong with the organization are complaining to someone else who has no ability to change it. In other words, there's no reason to complain in that moment. Don't get me wrong. If something's wrong, I want you to talk about it to the people who can fix it. But sometimes we just complain to other people for the sake of feeling, I don't know, because it's fun. Yeah, for the sake of feeling heard. Yeah, but also just because it's fun. And that's like the number one, not that those people are wrong, but it's often a huge sign that we've got some culture change coming down the pike.
Yeah. So David, you've been an awesome guest and really appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing all your knowledge. If people want to buy your book or learn how they can engage your services, how can they do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, they should do all of that, unless they hated this interview, in which case I have no idea why they're still listening. Probably the single easiest place. I've got a really weird name. Burkus is Burkus. So davidburkus.com is easy to find. But even if you forget the .com or you type it in wrong, like Google, there's not a lot of David Burkuses in the world. So it's probably pretty easy to find me. We're on all of the socials. So whichever one, if you're listening to this, is your favorite one, feel free to connect with me there. I'd love to keep this conversation going. I'm not naive enough to think that you can read my book and suddenly everything in your company is going to be magically fixed. You got to start putting things into practice. And as you do, you're probably going to have questions. So let's keep this conversation going.
David, I really appreciate you being on the conversation today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.